Now, to understand the fall of Dragon Age, we need to go back to the start. Dragon Age Origins released in 2009 and immediately cemented itself as one of the greatest RPGs of all time. It was dark, gritty, and unapologetically complex, with tactical combat that was reminiscent of BioWare's earlier titles of Baldur's Gate, Neverwinter Nights, and of course Knights of the Old Republic, and it had deep lore and characters that actually felt real. It wasn't afraid to challenge players with moral dilemmas that did not have easy answers. Interestingly enough though, Origins was actually set to be released as a multiplayer game, but subsequently it was changed to be a single player game after two separate occasions. Now next of course came Dragon Age 2, and the rushed development of that game led to some major flaws. Repetitive environments, simplified gameplay, but the heart of the series was still there. The character writing, the moral greyness, and the willingness to take risks made it clear that BioWare still had something to offer fans of the franchise. And then of course there was Inquisition. Yes, it won Game of the Year, and it brought the series into the open world era, and had its own moments of brilliance. But it also introduced a lot of cracks in design. It had bloated fetch quests, the combat system was divisive for fans of the franchise, and with the introduction of co-op multiplayer, it felt like the studio was moving away from what made the original so amazing to begin with. Despite the changes though, the game still maintained its gritty thematics and overall vibe that players love about the franchise. However, it did feel like BioWare was losing focus. An interesting side note, not long after that came The Witcher 3, which of course not only set a new standard for RPGs, but also exposed Inquisition's previously mentioned weaknesses in regards to open world and of course the combat system. But little did we know, Inquisition would mark the beginning of the end for Dragon Age. After Inquisition, fans waited nearly a decade for the next chapter in Dragon Age saga. Early plans for what would eventually become the Veilguard, codename Joplin, produced a smaller, story-driven adventure in Tevinter. But behind the scenes, things were already falling apart. David Gator, the series lead writer, left BioWare in 2016, marking the loss of one of Dragon Age's key voices. Meanwhile, Joplin faced constant disruptions as resources were pulled to salvage Mass Effect Andromeda and Anthem. By 2017, EA cancelled the project entirely, not because it wasn't working, but because it didn't align with their live service strategy. They then rebooted the project, which was now called Morrison, and it became a live service game built on Anthem's framework. But after the ill-fated Anthem's failure and the success of Respawn Entertainment's single-player Star Wars Jedi The Fallen Order, EA scrapped the multiplayer elements and pivoted back to single-player with Dragon Age The Veilguard. Years of wasted resources and constant vision shifts, however, had already taken their toll. By the time The Veilguard finally emerged, the creative team was almost entirely new, and the game bore little resemblance to the bold, narrative-driven RPG fans had been promised. But let's start with the gameplay, because the Veilguard doesn't just fail to innovate, it actively takes steps backwards. The tactical combat that defined Origins is completely gone. The party-based strategy that let you control your companions and plan your moves, that's gone too. Instead, we get basic, repetitive ARPG button-mashing combat with no real depth and no real challenge. And the puzzles? If you can even call them that. The Veilguard practically solves them for you before you've even had a chance to think. Compare that to the intricate dungeons and tough choices of Origins. This game assumes players don't want to be challenged anymore, an issue synonymous with many AAA titles released these days, and it assumes that we just want to go through the motions. Exploration? Linear. It's all surface level with absolutely nothing underneath. And of course, if the gameplay and narrative missteps weren't enough, we get to the main reason players hated this game so much. The Veilguard lit a firestorm of controversy over its obsession with identity politics. What should have been a dark, immersive fantasy ended up becoming a vehicle for modern social commentary, and for many fans, it completely shattered the very essence of what Dragon Age was to begin with. The controversy started before players even set foot in the game. Pronoun selection and top scar surgery as options for player characters completely divided the community, with many feeling it was a very jarring, clumsy attempt to modernise a fantasy world. Fans argued it wasn't the concept of inclusivity that bothered them. It was the heavy-handed way it was forced into a setting where it didn't naturally belong. And instead of immersing players, it completely pulled them out of the fantasy altogether. And of course, it didn't stop there. The story itself was shaped by a narrative team led by outspoken Twitter activists who were vocal about crafting a story for the mythical modern audience. But what players got was not a gripping dark fantasy. It was a series of shallow, preachy monologues. Characters regularly pause the story to essentially trauma dump the devs' real-life experiences, delivering painfully out-of-place speeches about personal struggles that had little to nothing to do with the stakes of the game. It didn't feel like Dragon Age at all. It felt like you're being lectured. As SkillUp aptly described it in his review, the dialogue feels like HR is in the room with you. Now compare this to the earlier entries, where representation was handled with subtlety and respect. As I mentioned in the previous video, take Krem from Inquisition for example. Krem was a transgender mercenary whose inclusion felt natural and unforced. Krem's character wasn't defined by activism or agendas. They were just another compelling piece of a complex world. The Veilguard, by contrast, felt like it was more interested in making a statement than telling a story.
So, I'm non-binary.
Something that Western AAA studios appear to be afflicted with these past few years. And for fans who fell in love with Dragon Age's gritty, morally complex world, this shift was an absolute slap in the face. A series that once balanced tough choices and dark themes has been replaced with sanitized messaging and soapboxing. For many, the Veilguard wasn't just disappointing, it was completely alienating. And if the identity politics turned fans off, the story itself was what truly broke their hearts. Dragon Age was once a series defined by its morally grey choices, intricate plots, and complex characters. But the Veilguard throws all of that out the window and replaces it with something unrecognisable. For instance, in the Veilguard, the portrayal of beloved characters like Morrigan and Isabella has sparked significant controversy among fans. Morrigan, who was once celebrated for her complex morality and enigmatic nature, is now depicted in a manner that some feel lacks the depth and nuance that defined her in previous installments. Similarly, Isabella's character has undergone changes that have left many fans disappointed. A Reddit discussion highlights this sentiment, with users expressing frustration over what they perceive as a betrayal of Isabella's established persona. These character portrayals have contributed to the broader criticism of the Veilguard, with fans feeling that the game fails to honour the depth and complexity of its beloved characters. Take the infamous apology scene for example. Instead of tensional drama, we get a clunky lecture on social etiquette. It feels like it was written for Twitter discourse and not for an immersive fantasy world. Fans don't want to be lectured when they're playing games. They want to be immersed in the world that they are playing in. And then there's the lack of player agency to begin with. Dragon Age used to let you shape the world, to play as a hero, an anti-hero, or even a villain. But in the Veilguard, you're railroaded into one direction. You can't make bold, dangerous decisions. You can't be truly evil. The game plays it safe at every turn, and the result is a story that feels hollow and meaningless. And the reaction from many fans was immediate and brutal. The Veilguard didn't just disappoint, it actively alienated the core audience who had stuck with the series for over a decade. And their key complaints were basic. The gameplay is overly simplistic with no tactical depth. The story is cringeworthy and preachy, written for a quote-unquote modern audience that doesn't exist, and the tone shift is jarring. It simply just doesn't feel like a Dragon Age game anymore. And let's not ignore the controversy surrounding the game's creative team. Many players felt that the overly political motivations of the developers completely overshadowed the storytelling. There's nothing wrong with inclusivity when it's done in a way that makes sense to the story and setting, but when it feels forced or out of place, it pulls players out of the experience altogether. And with the Veilguard, it feels like BioWare has officially buried the franchise. The magic is gone, and for many fans, so is the hope that it can never come back.